The sun was setting over Manhattan, casting long shadows on the city streets below. Inside an exclusive tech conference, Robert Mercer, a quiet billionaire investor, was deep in thought. He had seen a small tech company rise and fall before, but this time felt different. As his hands moved over the screen of his tablet, he could feel the weight of the decision ahead of him, whether to invest in this new, ambitious company or walk away. The room was filled with the hum of business deals, the sound of murmurs and clinking glasses. Mercer's sharp eyes scanned the crowd, calculating the risks and rewards in real time. He was always thinking 2 steps ahead, never revealing his true intentions. It wasn't just about money, it was about control. But control was something that was slipping from his grasp. As he turned away from the deal-making frenzy around him, he knew that this was a crucial turning point in his life, the beginning of something far greater than anyone could anticipate. As Mercer sat in the midst of the conference, he felt an unease creeping over him. The investors, the tech giants, the media moguls, they were all part of the machine. Yet, none of them had the depth of vision that he possessed. His mind moved swiftly, processing countless data points about the company in question. His first instinct told him it wasn't the right time, but his gut instinct, honed over years of experience, urged him to take the risk. This was his game, one he played in shadows and silence. He had mastered the art of remaining unnoticed while pulling strings behind the scenes. His hand gripped the tablet tighter, and a decision was made. Mercer would invest, but this time it wouldn't just be about money. This was about influence, shaping the future to his design. The quiet billionaire would no longer be hidden in the shadows. His time had come to step into the light, and he was ready. The decision weighed on Mercer's mind as the night wore on. He left the conference early, stepping out into the crisp air of Manhattan, the city lights illuminating the streets below. There was something unsettling about the gathering. Everyone around him was playing a game, but Mercer wasn't playing. He was creating the game. As he walked through the streets, his thoughts turned to the people in power, the ones who controlled the flow of information, and, by extension, the flow of influence. But it wasn't enough to control the data. Mercer needed more. He needed to control the narrative itself. He had already started laying the groundwork, quietly backing certain campaigns, funding movements. He had seen how powerful information could be. Now, it was time to take the next step. As he walked through the shadows, he felt a surge of excitement. The game was about to change. Mercer's move was calculated. He knew that entering the political sphere would take time, patience, and above all, strategy. He had made his fortune in the tech world, but now it was time to make his mark on something much larger. The company he had just invested in wasn't just a financial opportunity. It was a stepping stone to something far more important. As Mercer pored over more data in the privacy of his home, he began crafting a plan to influence political campaigns without ever being seen. Through careful investments and strategic partnerships, he would slowly begin to build a network of influence that could sway elections and change the course of history. All the while, he would remain in the shadows, unseen and untouchable. It was a game he knew well, and this time he intended to win. Weeks passed, and Mercer's quiet efforts were beginning to bear fruit. The first signs of his influence were subtle: whispers in boardrooms, small changes in political rhetoric. No one knew who was pulling the strings, but they could feel the shift. It was a shift in tone, in messaging. As Mercer's network of power expanded, so did his ambition. He was no longer satisfied with simply being a behind-the-scenes player. He was going to make his presence felt, to reshape the political landscape. The quiet billionaire who once observed from the sidelines was now becoming a force to be reckoned with. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one that would see Mercer's name etched into the history books, for better or worse. Robert Mercer had always played the long game. His initial investment in the tech company had already begun to yield impressive returns, but it was not enough. His ultimate goal was never just financial gain. Mercer wanted power, influence, and the ability to shape entire political landscapes, without ever stepping into the spotlight. Behind closed doors, he began to pour significant resources into a project that no one would ever see coming. He was quietly assembling a private army of data scientists and political strategists, each of them handpicked for their ability to influence public opinion through the power of information. His tool was simple but devastatingly effective: behavioral analytics. By predicting how people would react to various political messages, Mercer could craft campaigns that manipulated emotions, actions, and ultimately votes. This was just the beginning. The political game was changing, and Mercer was determined to be the architect. Mercer's influence began to grow in the political sphere, though his name remained largely unknown. Under the surface, a subtle but effective manipulation of public opinion was underway. Political ads began to feel eerily personalized, as if they knew exactly what voters cared about, but no one could trace the source. Mercer was using his vast data sets to craft these messages, and the results were startling. With each passing week, politicians seemed to align more with Mercer's interests, though no one suspected the quiet billionaire's hand in their campaigns. Meanwhile, Mercer remained careful, never stepping into the limelight. He knew that his power lay in being unseen. In the shadows, he continued to refine his methods, making small adjustments that, over time, would build into a tidal wave of influence. As the first elections influenced by his data manipulation loomed, Mercer watched from the sidelines, knowing that his invisible hand was about to make its mark on the world. As Mercer's methods gained traction, a new player emerged on the scene. Cambridge Analytica, a company that Mercer had quietly invested in and helped shape from the shadows, became the new face of political data manipulation. Under his guidance, the company refined its algorithms and expanded its reach. The firm promised to unlock the power of data for political campaigns, and that's exactly what it did. Through detailed psychographic profiling, Mercer's team was able to predict voter behavior with alarming accuracy. They knew exactly which messages would resonate, which issues to highlight, and how to frame candidates as champions for the masses. As the company's influence expanded, so did the scope of its operations. Mercer had successfully built a silent empire, a network of data-driven political power that was shifting the balance of power in the country. And all the while, he remained out of view, an enigma behind the curtain of modern political campaigns. Just as Mercer's influence seemed unstoppable, cracks began to appear in the armor of secrecy he had so carefully crafted. A former employee of Cambridge Analytica, feeling the weight of his conscience, decided to leak sensitive data to the press. The leak exposed the company's deep involvement in manipulating elections by using behavioral data to target voters with highly personalized political ads. The revelation sent shockwaves through the media and political circles as questions about privacy, ethics, and foreign interference flooded the news. But Mercer was not shaken. He knew the press would be distracted by the scandal, focusing on the moral outrage while missing the larger picture. The system was already in motion, and there was no turning back. The leak might have been a setback, but it was only a temporary obstacle in Mercer's long game. The real power was still his, and soon no one would be able to stop him. Despite the controversy, Mercer's network continued to grow. The leak had drawn attention, but it also created an opportunity. While politicians scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal, Mercer used the moment to quietly expand his influence. He began to form alliances with powerful media moguls, ensuring that his narrative remained dominant. His reach into political campaigns was undeniable, but now he was positioning himself for an even more ambitious play. Mercer was no longer just a shadow player. He was now preparing to take control of entire political movements. He knew the time had come to make his next move, to push the boundaries of what was legally and ethically possible. His quiet empire had served him well, but now it was time for the world to know his name. The quiet billionaire was preparing to make an unforgettable impact on the political system, and nothing would stand in his way. As Mercer's power in the political sphere continued to grow, he began to see the potential for an even larger game. He wasn't satisfied with simply manipulating elections. Now, he wanted to reshape the very structure of political campaigns. His network of influence had expanded beyond just data scientists and strategists. Now, Mercer had the ear of key political players across the spectrum. Through careful maneuvering and financial backing, he began to quietly fund and shape candidates who would carry his vision forward. He operated from the shadows, crafting the policies and platforms of those running for office, ensuring that the narratives they spoke aligned with his interests. The world may not have known Mercer's name, but his fingerprints were all over the political system. His influence had become so deep, so pervasive, that he was starting to realize something even more ambitious. He could control the direction of entire political movements without ever stepping into the limelight. Mercer's ability to manipulate elections and shape policy didn't go unnoticed for long. Rumors began to swirl about a mysterious benefactor behind certain political candidates, but no one could definitively prove the connection. Meanwhile, the media began to catch wind of the growing political influence that seemed to stem from anonymous, unseen sources. Despite the mounting pressure, Mercer remained calm. He knew that the key to his success was remaining out of sight, hidden behind layers of proxies and intermediaries. It wasn't about fame or recognition, it was about control. Behind the scenes, Mercer was now preparing to escalate his efforts even further. He started pulling the strings on national campaigns, ensuring that his selected candidates would rise to prominence in ways that would eventually lead them to the White House. To Mercer, this was no longer a game of politics. It was a matter of molding the future of the nation itself. As Mercer's chosen candidates gained ground, the political landscape began to shift in ways no one could predict. The messages that had once seemed radical or fringe were now becoming mainstream. With Mercer's influence, certain policies that once seemed impossible were now on the brink of acceptance. Public opinion was being reshaped with precision, and Mercer's hand was guiding it all from behind the scenes. He used his vast data network to identify the emotional triggers of voters, crafting messages that appealed to their deepest fears and desires. It was a carefully calculated effort to change the course of history. As his influence expanded, Mercer became more ambitious. He now had the power to influence entire political movements, even those that seemed to contradict his own interests. He had entered a phase of total control. His plan was coming together perfectly, and there was nothing that could stop him, or so he thought. The success of Mercer's manipulation started to attract the attention of rival factions. A group of powerful political adversaries who had once been able to push back against Mercer's quiet rise began to realize the full extent of his power. They saw the way that Mercer had been able to place his own candidates into positions of influence, all without ever directly appearing in the spotlight. This revelation sent shockwaves through the political establishment. With mounting pressure from these rivals, Mercer began to feel the walls closing in. He had always been the one pulling the strings, but now he was starting to see that the game might not be as one-sided as he once thought. If he wanted to stay on top, he would have to escalate his efforts and confront those who were beginning to challenge his control. The stakes were higher than ever, and Mercer knew that this was the moment that would define his future. Mercer wasn't about to let his rivals close in on him without a fight. He began to fortify his position, expanding his network of supporters and ensuring that his power was beyond reach. The next phase of his plan involved taking even more direct control over political discourse. Mercer sought to push the boundaries of traditional campaigning by launching a new, more aggressive strategy. He poured massive amounts of money into media outlets, ensuring that his messages dominated the airwaves. Every debate, every political ad, every news segment, all began to serve his vision. As his influence reached unprecedented levels, Mercer felt a thrill. He had become the invisible hand behind the political system, and nothing could stop him. But with his newfound power came a new set of challenges. His enemies were now working together, attempting to expose him for what he truly was, the puppet master pulling the strings of an entire nation. Mercer's ultimate test was about to begin, and he knew that this battle would determine the future of his empire. Mercer's political empire had grown far beyond what he had ever imagined. However, with his power came great scrutiny. The media, once content to ignore the quiet billionaire behind the curtain, now began to dig deeper into his methods. Whispers of corruption and backdoor deals began to surface. While Mercer had carefully cultivated a network of loyal allies in both the media and political spheres, the growing tide of public discontent was becoming impossible to ignore. Reports on his influence were no longer whispers in darkened rooms, they were headlines. As calls for investigations mounted, Mercer knew that the walls were closing in. The system he had built, one of secrecy, data manipulation, and subtle power plays, was now under threat. But Mercer wasn't one to back down. He had survived this long by staying 2 steps ahead. Now he would have to dig deeper, push further, and fight with everything he had. As the media frenzy reached its peak, Mercer began to lose control over the narrative. His allies in the media tried to suppress the mounting criticism, but their efforts were no longer enough. Public outrage grew louder, and the political establishment began to take notice. Rivals who had once been kept at bay now saw an opportunity. They mounted legal challenges and pushed for congressional hearings to investigate Mercer's operations. What had once been a quiet game had become a full-blown battle for survival. Mercer knew the time for subtle manipulation was over. If he wanted to retain his influence, he would have to fight back in the open. This was no longer about controlling the political landscape from behind the scenes. This was a direct confrontation. And Mercer, ever the strategist, prepared to go on the offensive, using every resource at his disposal to fight back against the tide of public scrutiny. Mercer knew that in order to regain control, he would have to go further than ever before. His financial empire was vast, and he began using his wealth to secure legal teams, spin doctors, and public relations experts. But it wasn't just about fighting the legal battle. It was about shaping public opinion once again. He launched an aggressive media campaign, flooding the airwaves with ads that painted him as the misunderstood genius, a visionary who was simply ahead of his time. He played the victim, portraying himself as a scapegoat in a system that was unwilling to embrace change. Slowly, but surely, the public's opinion began to shift. It wasn't enough to turn the tide completely, but Mercer had started to regain some ground. His response was calculated, a masterstroke in the art of perception. But even as he regained some control, Mercer couldn't shake the feeling that the biggest battle was yet to come. His enemies were more united than ever. Despite Mercer's best efforts, the pressure continued to mount. A critical blow came when a whistleblower, a former employee of one of his political organizations, leaked damning evidence of Mercer's covert operations. This time, there was no escaping the truth. The evidence was irrefutable. Mercer had been manipulating the political system, not just with data and advertisements, but with a network of payoffs and secret deals. The leak sent shockwaves through the nation. The public outcry was immediate and unforgiving. Even Mercer's most loyal supporters began to distance themselves from him, afraid of being implicated in his web of influence. For the first time in years, Mercer felt the weight of his empire crumbling around him. The walls he had so carefully constructed to protect him from scrutiny were now falling apart. The stakes had never been higher, and Mercer realized that the game he had played so expertly for so long was now threatening to destroy him. With his empire under siege, Mercer knew he had one final move to make. He began reaching out to his most trusted allies, pulling strings behind the scenes to orchestrate a last-ditch effort to salvage his power. He set up secret meetings with key figures in the government, offering them influence and financial backing in exchange for their loyalty. Mercer was determined to fight back, but this time, the game was no longer about subtlety. It was a war for survival. As the investigations into his actions gathered steam, Mercer doubled down, using his wealth to secure support and manipulate the system in ways he had never done before. His goal was simple: retain control at all costs. But as the stakes grew higher, Mercer began to realize that the cost of victory might be more than he was willing to pay. His empire was on the edge of collapse, and even his vast wealth might not be enough to save him. The heat of the political firestorm was finally starting to subside, but for Robert Mercer, the aftermath was just as devastating. His name had become synonymous with scandal, his empire crumbling in the wake of public backlash. His once loyal allies had scattered, and even his financial networks were showing cracks. Despite his immense wealth and influence, Mercer found himself facing an existential crisis, the realization that his pursuit of power had cost him everything he had once held dear. But beneath the surface of his turmoil, a part of Mercer knew he wasn't finished. It wasn't just about the wealth or the political control anymore, it was about redemption. He knew he had the means to rebuild, but whether he could recover his reputation, let alone his empire, was still uncertain. The question now was, could he find a way to fight back without repeating the mistakes of his past? Determined to regain some semblance of control, Mercer began to make overtures to the public. He launched a carefully curated media campaign designed to paint him as a man who had learned from his mistakes. But this time, the approach was different. Gone were the grandiose promises and the manipulative narratives. Instead, Mercer adopted a more vulnerable stance, confessing his flaws and mistakes. He spoke about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the lessons he had learned the hard way. It was a gamble, a man known for his secretive, powerful moves now publicly exposing his vulnerabilities. The media, ever hungry for a story, seized on the narrative. Some believed in his redemption, while others saw it as a calculated attempt to regain public favor. The response was mixed, but Mercer knew that no matter how small, this was his first step toward reclaiming his place in the world. While his media campaign slowly began to shift public perception, Mercer's financial empire still faced significant challenges. The legal battles were far from over, and the damage to his reputation was still a constant threat. In the quiet corners of his private life, Mercer started to reflect more deeply on the path he had taken. It became clear that his desire for power had overshadowed everything else: his relationships, his integrity, and even his own happiness. In an attempt to reconnect with the person he once was, Mercer began to explore new avenues for influence. He quietly restructured his business ventures, focusing on investments in emerging technologies that could benefit society. It wasn't just about regaining power. It was about creating a legacy that could stand the test of time. The road to redemption, Mercer realized, was long and filled with obstacles. But he wasn't about to give up on it yet. Despite his best efforts, the weight of his past decisions continued to haunt Mercer. His business dealings, though legitimate now, were constantly under the microscope. The public was still divided. Some praised his new, more ethical approach, while others remained skeptical, unable to let go of the image of the ruthless billionaire who once manipulated elections from the shadows. Mercer's internal struggle grew. Every success in his new ventures felt tainted by the past. He knew that to truly change, he would have to not only build a new future but also face the ghosts of his former actions. He took the bold step of reaching out to former rivals, attempting to repair old relationships and build new bridges. But in the back of his mind, Mercer couldn't help but wonder if the world would ever truly forgive him, or if his reputation was forever stained. As time passed, Mercer's efforts to rebuild his life began to show signs of progress. His ventures in technology and public service were slowly gaining traction, and his reputation started to shift, albeit incrementally. Still, the weight of his past loomed large. The world may have moved on, but Mercer knew that he could never truly erase the damage he had caused. In a final defining moment, Mercer attended a public forum, where he spoke openly about the lessons he had learned and the consequences of his past actions. He acknowledged his faults without trying to deflect blame, and in doing so, he became an unlikely symbol of personal growth and accountability. His words were raw, honest, and vulnerable. Whether or not he would ever fully redeem himself in the eyes of the world remained to be seen, but for the first time in years, Robert Mercer felt at peace with himself. The future was uncertain, but he was determined to face it with integrity. Just when it seemed that Robert Mercer might emerge from the wreckage of his past, a new wave of betrayal crashed over him. A former close ally, someone he had trusted implicitly during the height of his power, decided to turn on him. It was not an impulsive act, but a calculated one. This betrayal came with a revelation. Mercer's empire had not been as secure as he had believed. His ally, now seeking personal gain, leaked sensitive information about Mercer's hidden dealings. The damage was catastrophic. The leak wasn't just about past political manipulation. It exposed deeper, more dangerous connections to powerful foreign entities and covert financial transactions that Mercer had once hoped to bury. Mercer's world, already fragile, began to crack wide open. As the scandal unfolded, Mercer was thrust back into the limelight, not as a man seeking redemption, but as a puppet master caught in the crossfire of his own deceit. The revelation of Mercer's hidden dealings sent shockwaves through the media and political world. The story exploded across social networks, and within hours the damage to Mercer's reputation was immeasurable. Public's perception of him, once tentative and divided, now shifted sharply. No longer the misunderstood billionaire, Mercer was now a villain in the eyes of the public. His redemption story seemed like a distant memory, replaced by a narrative of manipulation, deception, and foreign interference. Even his allies distanced themselves, terrified of being caught in the fallout. In the midst of the storm, Mercer found himself more isolated than ever. The legal pressure mounted as investigations were launched, and public outcry reached a fever pitch. Yet despite everything, Mercer knew this might be the final test of his resilience. If he wanted to survive, he would have to confront his past in ways he had never imagined. In the face of overwhelming pressure, Mercer did what he had always done. He fought back. But this time, it wasn't about regaining control over his empire, it was about survival. He called in his remaining allies, the few who had stuck by him through the storm, and began to form a new strategy. His financial resources were still vast, but his position was far more vulnerable now. Mercer focused all his efforts on a counter-offensive, leaking documents that painted his former ally in a far worse light. He mobilized his legal teams to discredit the allegations and attempted to sway public opinion by framing himself as a victim of a calculated betrayal. Despite his best efforts, however, the more Mercer pushed, the more the public seemed to turn against him. It was clear now, the cost of his ambition had reached its peak. The world was no longer willing to forgive the man who had once been a kingmaker. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: the game had changed, and Mercer was no longer in control. As Mercer waged his battle in the courts of public opinion, he came to a devastating realization. His efforts were no longer enough. Despite his wealth, his influence, and his years of strategic planning, the betrayals were too deep, and the consequences of his past actions were too far-reaching. The foreign connections and financial dealings that had once been carefully hidden had now become his undoing. Investigations into his network exposed even darker truths, and what remained of his empire began to collapse. Political figures who had once stood by him now publicly denounced him, and even his most trusted confidants began to betray him for their own safety. As the legal and financial battles drained him of resources, Mercer found himself at the mercy of a system he had once sought to control. The world had turned on him, and the walls, once built to protect his secrets, were now closing in around him. In the final moments of Mercer's battle, as his empire crumbled and his personal world shattered, he found himself alone. The grand plans he had once conceived, the empire he had built, all seemed so insignificant now. His wealth, once a symbol of his power, had been drained in legal fees, settlements, and the public relations war. The redemption he had fought for seemed like a distant dream, replaced by the cold reality of his downfall. As he stood at the precipice of ruin, Mercer realized that the true cost of his ambition wasn't just the loss of power. It was the loss of everything he had ever cared about. He had gained the world, but at what cost? With nowhere else to turn, Mercer withdrew from the public eye, leaving behind the wreckage of his empire and the remnants of his reputation. His name, once a symbol of power, had become a cautionary tale, a warning to anyone who sought to play the game of power without understanding the consequences. The years of turmoil had passed, and Robert Mercer's name, once whispered in awe and fear, was now only spoken in hushed tones of disbelief. His empire, his legacy, had been reduced to mere whispers in the corridors of power. Yet, despite his fall from grace, Mercer remained a significant figure in the background of American politics. His influence, though shattered, still lingered in the form of political operatives who had once been his loyal servants. Some believed that Mercer's work had never truly ended. As the years went on, new political movements began to rise, ones that subtly echoed Mercer's strategies, albeit with fresh faces and a different approach. While Mercer had been pushed to the margins, the system he had manipulated so skillfully had continued without him, his ideas lingering like a ghost, haunting the future of American politics. Mercer's retreat from the public eye was no accident. His own choices had led him to this point, but the questions about his legacy haunted him relentlessly. In the quiet of his isolated home, he reflected on the lessons that had come too late. The power he had sought, the control he had worked so tirelessly to achieve, it had all slipped through his fingers. Now, as he watched the next generation of leaders rise, he saw how the game was being played differently. The methods of influence that he had pioneered were being used by others, but this time, there was no longer any need for secrecy. The lines between truth and manipulation had blurred so much that the power Mercer had once wielded no longer seemed so dangerous. In fact, it seemed almost inevitable, a part of the very fabric of modern politics. Mercer had failed to change the system. The system had instead changed him. As Mercer's mind drifted back to his rise and fall, he realized how deeply he had underestimated the impact of his actions. What had once seemed like an individual quest for power had turned into something far larger, an entire system that was now built on the same foundations he had laid. The moment of his greatest power had been brief, but the consequences of that power echoed through the years. Mercer was no longer a kingmaker, he was a cautionary tale. His name had become synonymous with manipulation, ambition, and downfall. Yet, even as the world moved on, there were moments when Mercer couldn't escape the quiet voice in his mind, asking whether it had all been worth it. The truth was, he would never truly know. His legacy was too complex, too intertwined with the very fabric of American politics, and in the end, he was left with the unshakable feeling that his fate had been sealed the moment he chose to play the game. In the final moments of his story, Mercer was confronted by the reality of his existence. No longer the powerful figure who could shape the future, he was now a man estranged from the very world he had helped create. The people he had once manipulated were now the ones who controlled the game, and he was an observer from the sidelines. Some wondered if he had truly changed, but the truth was more elusive. Redemption had always been a distant dream, a fleeting notion he could never fully grasp. His story had unfolded with power and ambition, but it was now a tale of quiet reflection and painful acknowledgement. He was no longer a force to be reckoned with, no longer feared or admired. Instead, Robert Mercer was a figure lost in the pages of history, a cautionary tale whispered about in boardrooms and political backrooms, his influence only remembered as a symbol of how easily power can corrupt, and how even the mightiest can fall. The final chapter of Mercer's life played out in solitude, with the echoes of his actions reverberating through history. His name would live on, but not in the way he had once imagined. He was neither a hero nor a villain, but rather a product of his time, a man who had sought to control destiny, but had ultimately been swept away by it. The world continued to turn, new players rose to prominence, and the game of power continued, as it always had. Yet as Robert Mercer faded into the past, there remained an unspoken truth. The legacy of his ambition was not just in the systems he had built, but in the lessons they imparted. The world had changed, and perhaps in the end, that was the most powerful thing he had ever accomplished. His story, like so many before him, was one of rise and fall, of dreams built on fragile foundations. And as the final curtain closed, Mercer's legacy was sealed, a reminder that power, no matter how fleeting, always leaves its mark.